Hi, everyone. This is the lecture for Chapter 12 for Principles of Scientific Inquiry, Biology and Psychology 2056 at Algoma University. Chapter 12 concerns ethics and responsibilities within the field of science and in the employment of scientific method. There are a lot of words, obviously, that fall under the category of ethics, or at least that are intensely related to what ethics are, that give us an idea of just what they are. So this is a word cloud related to the term ethics, and you can see all kinds of things around there, such as moral, right, morality, things like that, issues, concepts, philosophy, lots of words that are clearly related to this. So we're going to talk a little bit about ethics, and we're going to talk in particular about ethics as it pertains to being a professional scientist. Okay. So I'm just going to advance. There are two elements to the outline: philosophical ethics and then professional ethics. The smallest part, and you'll see that the first part is the smallest part. Philosophical ethics we'll cover very briefly. In fact, I think it's only one slide, and then the rest of this relatively short lecture will concern professional ethics. So when we talk about philosophical ethics, we've already discussed that science cannot be productive of ethical rules. So science cannot be used to answer the question, what is right, what is good, should we do something, you know, like should we employ nuclear power, should we do X genetic alterations on somebody. So that's something that science cannot do, but we can talk a little bit and fairly extensively about ethical behavior by scientists. By underpinning that discussion and any disagreements we may have as a class of scientists, as a group of scientists, that's the basis for our ethical thinking. So examining our agreements and our disagreements, and examining generally agreed upon ways that individuals should behave. In the broader sense, ethics from a philosophical standpoint raises challenging and difficult questions such as these. Does justice permit inequality of income and ownership? This is a classic question, and it's of course germane to today because income inequality is growing in advanced democracies or in Western democracies and becoming stronger and stronger. So what that means essentially is that a larger and larger proportion of available money or riches have accumulated in fewer and fewer individuals' control. So does justice require compensatory action to remedy inequalities which are the result of past injustice, even if those who pay the costs of such compensation had no part in that injustice? So there's a considerable talk right now about reparations in the Western world, in North America in particular, to pay to indigenous peoples. What sorts of compensation or reparations should be given these individuals? This is a moral and an ethical question. So this is a question, of course, that is germane currently. There are also discussions in the United States of America of whether current generations of African Americans should receive some sort of compensation for past inequalities or past injustices related to slavery. Does justice permit or require the imposition of the death penalty? And if so, for what offenses, right? So is the death penalty right? This is a philosophical and a difficult question, and is one that many people have disagreements about. It's not one that is easily afforded agreement, although in Canada there's general agreement, and there's polls show there's popular agreement that we should not go in the direction of the death penalty. But in the States, it is still legal and employed by a number of states, sparingly but and decreasingly. But whether such an imposition of the death penalty for an individual who's committed a grievous crime is right or just is an ethical question. Is it just to permit legalized abortion? This is a question that many people feel very strongly about in diametric, in opposing directions. It's a difficult and fraught question. It's not a question that people who come down on different sides of the question like to talk about with each other, because it invokes considerable emotional capital, and people have angry disagreements. But it is an ethical dilemma. When is it just to go to war? This is one that also sparks passionate ideology. All you have to do is think back to all of the protests of the Vietnam War in North America and beyond, and they were quite strong. And then there were also counter demonstrations that felt it was just to go to war, and there's disagreement since on whether the Gulf Wars should have occurred, and whether the United States should have endeavored to push people into the Afghan war, et cetera, et cetera. When is it right, or when is it just to go to war? These are ethical questions as well, and difficult ones. So one of the problems related to tackling these ethical questions is the tendency for us to want to not talk about them, probably, or not even perhaps, I would say, to avoid arguments. We often look to one another and we try to find common ground. Focusing on places that may not be common ground to have discussion is not something that we're likely to invest a lot of time in, right? So I don't go looking for people who disagree with me on what the evidence supports in terms of the theory of organic evolution, and pick fights or pick discussions with them. Sometimes they happen, and sometimes they come to me. Other times, what is right and what is just is sometimes even more fraught. You can't even bring evidence to that kind of discussion, whereas I can at least bring evidence to a discussion of organic evolution. It's difficult to bring appropriate scientific evidence to a discussion of that. Now, that doesn't mean that scientific evidence can't inform a discussion of an ethical dilemma, but it cannot decide it for it, and it cannot inform directly the ethical question, only indirectly. So Sandel, an ethicist, a professional ethicist, suggests that the key to addressing these questions is to have an engaged society that discusses these issues openly and is not scared of disagreement, but is invested in finding what common ground is available. This is often a very challenging thing, and if for no other reason, politicians use these kinds of debates as dividing lines to separate the electorate and try to bring the majority onto their side, or to try to gain political favor amongst a group for causes that are unrelated to that. So single issue politics become a problem under that guise. So for example, someone who is a pro-life proponent may vote for a party that has many other policies that they might disagree with, but because that pro-life policy or pro-life stance is so important to them, it supersedes any of those other disagreements that they might have. So probably the answer to this question of how many of you avoid discussing politics, and I'll add religion to that, with friends, it's probably not a conversation that people like to have. It can be difficult, it can be insulting, people can feel as though their ideas and their thoughts and their beliefs are not valid, or not considered valid, or given a chance in those sorts of conversations, and they can lead to disagreement, fights, and the ends of friendships. So people are fairly cautious on that from that standpoint. So I'm sure lots of you have avoided and continue to avoid them. The view that we can only do our best to find agreement on ethical principles is in line with science's inability to provide those answers, right? So agreement is the best we can do here. So this may be familiar to some of you. We've discussed how some people feel that scientific truth is only a matter of agreement as well, putting it on par with ethical ideas and ethical notions. This is the same as saying the question of whether the death penalty is just is on par with the question of whether water is composed of H2O. I'll leave it to you to decide that, but this course certainly, and the sciences in general, take the standpoint that those are two very different types of questions and that are not equivalent in structure at all. Okay, and then, as I said, that was a short section. The next section will be on professional ethics, which is something that I find very interesting, and I certainly think about and have thought about a fair bit. So if any of you out there have actually ever sat an interview with me or volunteered with me, you may recognize some of the things from discussions that we've had cropping up in this section, and I've certainly learned over time how to better pay attention to these kinds of things, especially where professional ethics concerns the mentoring role and the mentee role. So someone who works with a mentor or a supervisor can be called a mentee. Okay. All right, so the National Academy of Science produced this book back in 2009. It's called On Being a Scientist, A Guide to Responsible Conduct in Research. It's, I believe, freely available, and it's a practical guide without ethical grounding. So ethical issues in science can be classified in a variety of ways. One, as scientific misconduct. This includes fabrication. You can fabricate your data, you can fabricate your results, you can fabricate analysis, a number of things that can be fabricated. Fabrication simply means made up, right? Falsification is more of a manipulation than fabrication, right? So it concerns the manipulating of your data or your results to lead to a very particular message. Okay, and finally, plagiarism. So taking one another's ideas and presenting them as your own. And some people have actually asked me why plagiarism is even an issue in academia, and I've been asked this before. Why is it such a big deal to copy other people's work? And isn't it an important, like isn't copying the sincerest form of flattery? And all of that. Yes, but in academia, the idea is here that we give credit where credit's due for these different ideas. And there's a distinction between presenting ideas that are not your own and presenting ideas that are your own. The idea of science, being a scientist, is to advance our knowledge. Repeating somebody else's knowledge or repeating what somebody else has found and asserted is not advancing our knowledge. All right, it's advancing your reputation on the basis of somebody else's hard work. So plagiarism is very important. One of the goals of liberal arts and sciences education is to develop independent thought. Independent thought is diametrically opposed to plagiarism. So if I want to understand your independent thought, I don't want you plagiarizing somebody else. That's not to say that you can't reference somebody else's work in order to advance it further or to collate a variety of ideas that others have had into some synthesized whole, synthesized idea, right? So reviewing all that and bringing it together and coming up with a new synthetic of those different ideas, or synthesis of those different ideas, is a great idea. And it is the way of advancing knowledge. So that's why referencing is so integral. You've heard the expression standing on the shoulders of giants. This is the idea that science wishes for each of us to stand on the shoulders of those who've come before us in the field of science. So to take others' ideas and grow them or expand upon them. So plagiarism is considered, therefore, a form of scientific misconduct. And then there are other questionable research practices, and these can be summarized as sort of smaller level or smaller scale violations. Academic institutions generally have processes in place to address these particular types of behaviors, and they do crop up and appear from time to time. We can discuss a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so there are different professional groups out there. Not all of them are scientists, and some of those professional groups have their own codes of ethics. So this is one example of the code of ethics for a particular professional group that I was able to find. There is some basic ethics in the preamble related to quality of life and obligations to our profession, etc. But there's no code for personal ethics within here. So this is a professional behavior. For example, there's no mention of what to do when you're in conflict with the goals of your own work, right? So what happens when you have been invested in developing a drug for 15 years and your data say that it doesn't work, right? So your goals are to create a drug, and your data are in conflict with that. This can also work. This can also arise in military work. Let's say you are a military contractor and you're developing some sort of technology that was to be used in a particular way, but somebody realized that it could be used in another more lethal or more incendiary way that could produce some conflict between what you want and what the work is going to be used for. So there's no guidance in these kinds of codes of ethics on how a person is expected to proceed in the face of that kind of dilemma. And that is the kind of dilemma that can crop up and should be thought about by professional scientists. So each of the subsections these subsections summarize a chapter from the book on being a scientist, a guide to responsible conduct in research. Okay, so an advisor. What is the role of an advisor? So if you continue on within your degrees, you may become a thesis student. If you become a thesis student, you will have an advisor. And an advisor oversees a research project. So I've taken on this role a number of times, and I work with students to develop and take part in and develop and execute a research project. A mentor is someone who just simply takes interest in someone's professional development, right? So I've taken on this role as well. Several students who I've developed a rapport with will come to me and ask advice, even if they're not a thesis student of mine, or even if they're not in my classes. They may just wish to say, hey, what should I do in this circumstance? Can you give me some advice? And I do my best to do that. A good mentor provides actual help, encouragement, and collegiality, so the mentee has a positive experience, right? And the same would be true for an advisor. In an advisor, you wish for a student or a mentee to have a positive experience. To avoid disagreement and disappointment, in each case, the expectations for the people participating in these relationships should be laid out directly. So this involves communication, right? So it's important to lay out your expectations. So when I take a volunteer into my lab, I have a discussion of my expectations in terms of what I expect students to do and how I expect them to carry out their work. And then I ask them what their expectations or desires are in taking on this position as a volunteer. So as an advisor or a mentor, I take that role seriously, and I'm interested in learning about what students wish to gain from their experience. And if I can, designing the work or laying out the work in such a way that it meets the needs of the particular individual or meets the expectations of the particular individual. For example, if they wish to learn about how to manipulate data, I set up, and I have data that needs manipulating, then I can direct them to that work so that both of us can experience a positive outcome and both of our expectations are met. So both individuals should benefit. That's a goal that I have as an advisor and a mentor. So I hope and I try to find ways to make that kind of relationship work. And I also hope that in the process, both of us can grow a little bit. So I can grow as an advisor and a mentor and learn how to do a better job of that. And I hope that the individual that I'm working with can grow and develop in that role as well. Okay. The mentor should grow through an exposure to a wide range of areas, and I take that to heart, so I try. And the mentee should grow with help and support. Some institutions even reward mentorship. At Algoma, it is informal and not rewarded, although if I take on thesis students, I receive a financial reward for that, or a financial allocation. You can call it a reward, but I get paid for it, essentially a small amount. Okay. Another section from that book, data must be gathered carefully and accurately. Now that seems fairly basic to start with, and this is on the treatment of data. Methods for data collection must be described carefully within the body of papers. So when you create a scientific paper and then go to submit it to a journal, reviewers will look at it. Those reviewers need to be able to understand the validity of the collection and any drawbacks related to conclusions that are drawn from that information. So the methodology has to be clear and has to illustrate how the data collection avoids any potential pitfalls and makes it possible for the authors to and the scientists to draw the conclusions that they do. Published errors can take on a life of their own, so care has to be taken before publication is reached. Most of the students that I have who I've worked with towards getting a publication ready for submission have been a little surprised at the degree of care taken in editing and going over the paper before submission. So they're often surprised. So for example, if a student of mine is trying to develop a manuscript, usually I name the file with their last name and then a version number, and I usually name it 001. And they're often shocked and they're like, well, I'm not going to have 999 versions, am I? But several times I've gone into the 40s or 50s with different versions. So maybe I could get away with 01, but sometimes I put 001 just to freak them out a little bit, just for a little joke. Right, but anyway, as you can see, the vaccination autism connection, right? So there was a publication a number of years ago that suggested there may be a link between vaccination and autism. Even though that paper was retracted, proven wrong, proven to be subject to false data, and several papers since then have shown clearly that there is no relationship between autism and vaccination. There is a huge proportion of the population who's concerned about that connection still. That news made it out into the world, and it's hard to undo that, right? So care has to be taken up front to avoid that kind of thing. Okay. Data checking should be built into the methodology used, although it isn't often mentioned. So I read papers all the time. I don't often see anything about cross-validation of data or examination of the data or running it through filters that can highlight unusual patterns that wouldn't be expected unless there was an error in the data. There are increasingly tools that can help you identify whether there are problems like that. And they're becoming more available in programs like R, which is a statistical program that I've mentioned before. It's a free program. And things like that are coming out. My students, for example, though, have found errors in our data when checking through it. These can add up if care isn't taken and can affect conclusions. So that's important. So part of my process in collecting data is to cross-validate. So as I've mentioned in lectures before, if a student is out censusing a plot of vegetation and figuring out what's there, usually I will have students switch and do it and check. So multiple students will do the same plot and then they'll check for accuracy. And until that level of accuracy is quite high, they cannot proceed to independently collect those data. And if they can't figure it out, they just have to keep repeating it and taking averages or repeating checks. Data repositories are becoming prominent. So when I submit a paper now, it asks me, where am I going to put this data so that it's publicly available once the paper is published? And so there are several free and paid repositories that are available that people can use. This is becoming normal so that others can look at the data and see if there's any problems later on, or retest them to make sure that they can come up with the same results that the original publisher or the original scientist did. Science is, so there are some mistakes and negligence, the difference between the two, right? Science is done by humans, and humans, as we've talked about, are prone to a number of mistakes, both in logic and in the way we do things. At the cutting edge, scientists tend to take, or must sometimes take, some risks. Problems can result from a variety of things. They can result from carelessness. They can result from trying to rush. So sometimes there's a motivation to advance a particular analysis or scientific project quickly so as to ensure that nobody else does the same thing before you. Sometimes that process of rushing can be problematic and can lead to mistakes. You can collect too few replicates, so not recognizing the need to collect more replicates can waste time, can even slow you down, or can lead to you making a mistake or drawing the wrong conclusions from your data. And those conclusions can be reported, and that can slow down scientific progress by leading people to believe one thing is true when in fact it is not. Okay. We actually know a lot about what kinds of mistakes are most frequently made in different disciplines, and that is a great thing, right? So if we know when and where those kinds of mistakes are most frequently made, we can do a lot to try to avoid making those mistakes and towards mitigating and correcting them as necessary. We've learned various techniques for cross-checking, so I've already mentioned some of that. And we have to acknowledge as well that there's a lot of responsibility on the scientist, right? So review by independent reviewers solicited by the journal's editor to review work before it's published. It's going to be imperfect. It cannot be expected to catch all errors. I've done this process many times, and reviewing often leaves you with questions about how things are done that you can ask, but it's hard to know, it's hard to imagine being able to ask all the right questions and being able to catch certain types of errors is certainly not easy. Some errors are easy to catch, others not so much. That shouldn't really even be the reviewer's primary job. By the time it gets to a reviewer, those errors should have been reduced by the experimental scientists themselves, so as to make the job of the reviewer much more manageable. Okay. Research misconduct. This kind of behavior is really at odds with what science is supposed to be able to accomplish. It has serious consequences as well, and it may result in lost employment. So scientists can be fired for this kind of misconduct, but it can also harm the reputation of an institution or science entirely. So as I mentioned, there's a scientist in Ontario at McMaster University in biological sciences who is currently under investigation for research misconduct. That individual is lawyered up, and it's well, I believe they have, and it's understood that they are battling for their professional life, but there are some questions about their conduct in terms of whether data were fabricated, manipulated, or whatnot. It may also harm the reputation of the institution. So if that institution doesn't handle it very well, their reputation could be hurt as well. So fabrication, making up data and or results, as we've already talked about. Falsification is manipulating research materials, processes, equipment, or changing or omitting data or results that don't, so that the research isn't properly reported. Some of these things you can actually, if you take a look at the data distributions, you can find some evidence that this kind of thing is being done. So people are learning how to look for this better, and it's possible that in the future, part of review will be submitting your data to these kinds of analyses. I don't know yet. It's the kind of thing that's growing in interest. The appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving them appropriate credit is plagiarism, right? There's also self-plagiarism, and that occurs when an author reuses substantial parts of his or her own work without providing appropriate references or quotes or something like that. So I could get in trouble for reusing text from my own papers in a second paper. That's also considered inappropriate. Okay. Misconduct is generally intentional rather than accidental. So fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism is more often than not intentional. Although plagiarism could be accidental, it tends not to be. So don't cut and paste. You can avoid, and I tell students this quite directly, the best way to avoid plagiarism is if you're writing a paper and you're taking bits from different areas, write point form notes from different areas, from the sources that you're examining, and then transcribe those point form notes into your own sentences later on. It's very unlikely that you're going to transcribe them into your own way of talking in such a way that completely reproduces the original. That's a great way to do it, especially the shorter form you can break your notes down into, the more likely that you'll be safe and avoid these kinds of things. And just as you take those notes, make sure you record where it's coming from so that you can cite them. So yeah, putting things in your own words, even if you're referencing them, is important. Otherwise, you have to put quotes, and most people don't quote things in the scientific literature. So some institutions have added to this list and put in other kinds of misconduct. It's institution specific. Okay. Science is not policed, right? So there's no science police, although as you may or may not have noticed, there are investigations that are carried out on different scientists, usually by institutions that host them or groups, but it's not policed. Okay, so we have to report misconduct if we find it. And that can be awkward and problematic. What if I found out that a senior colleague was involved in such misconduct? How should I handle that? Several students have faced this if they found some sort of misconduct. That misconduct case I was referencing, that certainly some of the former students of that individual found were some of the first people to recognize these problems. So if I brought these up, I have to do so in such a way as to try to minimize any risk I put myself at. Let's say I'm an untenured, or either a student or an untenured professor, and I'm accusing a senior tenured professor of misconduct. I could put my own job at risk, so I have to be very careful. So it's prudent to begin investigating these situations with questions rather than accusations. So asking questions is a great way to avoid putting yourself in a position where you've made an accusation that you can't justify later on or is unproven. So asking questions is a good way to do that. It's also a good idea to ask yourself hard questions about your own motivations and potential biases, and whether others will likely raise these issues if you bring this up. So are you going to be accusing somebody who you are competing with for grant funding or something like that? These are the issues that others will see, so it's worthwhile to consider them yourself before going forward with these kinds of things. Research on, or at least before determining how to go forward on them. I'm not saying you should not go forward with them. You've got to find some way to report misconduct if it's out there. So research on human subjects or on animals generally requires that researchers follow different guidelines or specific guidelines. So this is professional ethics related to human and animal participation in research. Not surprisingly, this is to avoid researchers subjecting participating animals, human or otherwise, to inappropriate treatment. Most regulations generally follow the 3 R's: reduction, so use as few animals as you can. So I've already highlighted that using a Bayesian statistical paradigm is one way to ensure that you can use as few animal subjects as you need. Refinement of the procedures to minimize pain and distress. So find ways to minimize any pain and distress that the individuals are subject to. And replacement of conscious living higher animals with insentient materials wherever possible. So do your best to handle this, find replacements where possible. So I know that different, for example, mammals are subjected to slightly different rules in Canada in terms of what you can and cannot do than are some other animals like insects or even amphibians. So researchers must follow government regulations and professional guidelines for safety in the lab. So safety in the lab, most of you will have taken a lab course at Algoma already, and you've had to take a health and safety quiz or an instructional seminar and go through an instructional module to ensure that you're ready to participate in lab activities safely. Accidents can happen regardless of that training, and we're required to make efforts the best we can to minimize the potential for this, to see that we can minimize those kinds of impacts. Okay. It's estimated that about 500,000 workers in the USA handle hazardous biomaterials every single day. So that gives you a sense of how important this kind of problem is. Regulations include safety equipment and clothing, safe operation of equipment, safe disposal of materials, hazard assessment processes, safety training like WMIS, so you're all required to take WMIS training, emergency equipment, showers, eye wash stations, first aid kits. Some of this is quite expensive, so places like Algoma University invest substantially in our health and safety. I know personally I also invest in the health and safety of my students, so I buy safety equipment where necessary. I have goggles in the lab depending on what's going on. I have hard hats that students can wear if they're going in the forest. I have bear spray for students going out into the field where there may be bears. And of course, I give them some training in the use of that bear spray as well. And that involves some instructional video. And I try to get my students first aid trained as well, so that for minor scrapes and even bone breaks and things like that, students are ready to, as best they can, handle situations, first aid situations, as they may arise when they're working with me either in the lab or field. All right, so sharing of research results. Scientists share their results by publishing them in journals. We've talked about that many times now. Other authors or scientists will then reference that work, giving credit where due and leaving a trail for interested parties to trace ideas to the original source. So if I find an idea that I'm reading about that I really like, I can go back and see where that idea originated. So let's say I read it in a paper, but the idea was referenced further back. I can go back to the original source. And what that means and what that enables is for me to make sure that the place where I read it has referenced it correctly. So I've actually read situations like that where referencing is done incorrectly, and being able to go back to the source is an important way to correct this. So I just received and have been in the process of reviewing a paper that cites some of my own work and does so incorrectly. So I will make sure that they actually say something that is nowhere in any of my papers, let alone the paper that they wrote, that they referenced. So I'll let them know as part of the review that they've incorrectly referenced that, so that the trail eventually, because the paper is otherwise quite useful, when it's published, it won't incorrectly lead other scientists back to my paper, where they'll find a very different idea than the one presented here or in that paper. So one idea is common knowledge. It no longer, once an idea is common knowledge, it no longer has to be referenced. So I don't need to reference the statement water is H2O. It's a fine line though, what is common knowledge. So if you don't know whether something's common knowledge or not, just reference it. Water is H2O is a fairly obvious example, but something closer to the line of common knowledge may not be. So just err on the side of caution where necessary. Okay. It's also very important that a reference is appropriate. So sometimes people will make a reference or reference other individuals' work when making a statement in a paper, and that reference may not support the statement being given. That's a common error, and that's an incorrect attribution. And that can be problematic as well. I've seen lots of examples of that. Okay, every author has a, well, not every author, but authors' scholarships are sort of followed, and people's citations are a measure of the importance and quality of their work. So this is a Google Scholar page of my own, and it highlights, this is old actually, so this is from 2014, but it tells basically how many citations I have and gives some information about where those citations are on which papers, and gives you, that's one very blunt tool for being able to compare the scholarly activities of different researchers. So you can see in this case, in 2014, my papers have been cited 456 times, and we can compare that to one of my own heroes, Professor Robert May from Oxford University, whose work I've cited many times, and his work has been cited a total of 104,577 times, and that was by 2014. It's probably much higher than that now. You can go to Google Scholar and look up different researchers if you want. It's also a great way to find papers. So my papers are all linked in on my Google Scholar site, and you can go find papers that way. And also, if you know an author is doing work that interests you, Google Scholar and other such tools are great for exploring other work done by a particular individual. Okay. So authorship and allocation of credit. Okay. So the reference list, I've drawn an example of a reference list here. At the bottom, it's a list of authors, the authors of a paper. Sorry, not the reference list, but an authorship is a list of the authors of the paper that indicates who did the work. Recognition impacts the careers of the individuals that are listed or not listed. So it's a good idea to establish, when you're working on a project, who will be an author for a given paper well in advance to reduce difficulties and arguments. So I try to be very clear on this topic with my students when these topics come up, and I say, listen, this is how I work. These are my rules for authorship. Are you okay with that? Are you not okay with that? And then we proceed. Okay. It definitely, authorship reflects direct and substantial contributions to the project, so not minor contributions most of the time. It's also common to acknowledge smaller or lesser contributions in the acknowledgments section, which is towards the end of the paper, usually just before the reference section, that acknowledges help received. Okay, so something that would fall into the acknowledgments section is sort of volunteers who help with a little bit of lab work or field work might go in the acknowledgments section. The author list usually also lists those accountable for the work. So it's not just a reward, but you're accountable. If there are any problems, then you're responsible for those problems. So you get credibility for success, but also accountability for any errors in the work. One thing that we don't often think of, and maybe I don't think of it because I've never done any research that warrants any kinds of patents or copyrights, but scientific work can be of significant value, right? So it was just in the news, for example, that one company that was developing a COVID-19, so I'm filming this during the COVID-19 pandemic, the COVID-19 virus company that's been developing one was offered something like $10 billion for the company. So that's significant value for the work that they're undertaking at that particular company. That value can be measured in the advancement of science, contribution to useful government policy, and for industrial development of new technologies or development of new medical technologies, as I just sort of gave you an example of. Intellectual property is something slightly different. It secures the rights of an individual to control the use of an idea by means of a patent or a copyright. So what are they? They are legal tools, patents and copyrights are, and they're designed to balance private gains with public benefits. So giving people credit, but also ensuring that the ideas that someone develops become available to the general public. Researchers, nonprofit organizations, and companies can profit from an idea in exchange for the property owner making the new idea public, which encourages further advances. Copyrights protect the expression and presentation of ideas, but not the ideas themselves, which can be used with proper attribution. So copyrights are slightly different than patents. All right, so competing interests, commitments, and values. Conflict of interest. This is a conflict of interest is when a scientist's personal, intellectual, and financial interests come into conflict. An example would be a researcher may wish to commercialize some research, and to speed this up, assign several undergraduates to related projects, even if these projects are not ideal for the education of those students. Okay. That's a situation that should not happen. Scientists can financially gain from the products of their work, but it is important that this not lead to substandard work or exaggerated claims. Right? So you don't want to rush through. Personal relationships can be a problem as well. For example, I should not review my best friend's research grant. Right? My good friend from graduate school is a researcher at another university, and I've been sent his papers before and asked to review them, and I just generally say no. Right? So I think it's a healthy practice to do that. The same friend was invited to review my paper and declined to at one time, so he's doing the same thing. Okay. Other conflicts of interest may arise from strong philosophical, religious, cultural, or political beliefs, where these can have have a negative impact on objectivity and bias, researchers should do their best to minimize the impact of those differences where they possibly can. Okay. So a researcher's position in society. Scientists could be called upon to give expert witness or advice, and this is increasingly happening, right? You'll recall that I talked about scientists being called upon to present at trials in the law, and that judges are even being required to learn about science so that they can understand evidence being given. Governments may wish for guidance on something like climate change policy. Scientists are being called to do this all the time. Companies may wish for advice on how to get nuclear fusion going, right? So they may seek the help of scientists. They may even employ scientists directly. Courts may call a researcher to testify about forensic evidence. So there's some DNA evidence being taken here, being testified on, and there's some other evidence there, pictorial evidence about something else, I think. But expert witnesses is something that scientists can be called as well. When scientists become advocates, as a climate scientist may be for CO2 reductions, they could be seen, and they may, and I think there's some evidence that they are seen by colleagues or by the public as biased, holding a specific political position that influences their work. I've certainly heard suggestions that, oh, scientists are just a bunch of liberal environmental tree huggers and so on and so forth. So scientists have to be careful about advocacy, and they should focus their sort of advocacy on being very evidence-based to do their best to minimize accusations of personal bias. Scientists have the right to express those convictions, though, and also to defend their work in terms of shaping important policy, but that defense should be on the basis of evidence. And that's really the end of this ethics lecture. And we can stop at that point. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thanks.